Hello, I'm Linda Elder. I am the president of the Foundation for Critical Thinking. I would like to introduce you to our work, to our organization, and tell you a little bit about our history and talk about why critical thinking is so important in human societies. The Foundation for Critical Thinking is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in California. Our organization begins in 1991 to support the work of the Center for Critical Thinking, which was established in 1980 by the late Dr. Richard Paul at Sonoma State University. The history of critical thinking is important because we need to understand, first of all, why we need critical thinking, why we need a center and a foundation for critical thinking, why we need to be working toward more critical thinking. So we begin with the history of critical thinking. I would say the current history in the 1970s and moving into the 1980s, where we begin to have scholars focusing on the concept of critical thinking. We begin to see the term critical thinking in these early years. And this is coming out of a need to improve instruction. It's coming out of a need that is being shown through research studies that are illuminating the fact that students are not achieving critical thinking while they're going through their educational processes. So in the 1970s, 1980s, we began to see that students have been going to school for many years, but they're not learning fundamental critical thinking skills. And from this, we begin to see a movement toward bringing critical thinking into the classroom. You could say the 1980s, we have more what I would call a trend or a fad in critical thinking, where people are starting to say, oh, that's great, we want that, we want critical thinking. We've done cooperative learning and we've done technological education, and now we need critical thinking. And we want to get our critical thinking in a couple of days, and we are willing to come to a workshop or a conference for a day or two, as long as we can get our critical thinking very quickly. And of course, critical thinking is not achieved in a simplified way. It is not achieved over a couple of days. It is achieved, if at all, over a lifetime of trying to become a fair-minded, critical person. So the Foundation for Critical Thinking is here to support the work of the Center for Critical Thinking, which is focused on research. We offer conferences in critical thinking. We offer workshops, we offer professional development programs, and I'll talk a little bit more about our outreach presently. If we want to understand the history of critical thinking, we really need to go back many years in history, and we can go back to the thinking and the life of Socrates about 2,400 years ago, because at that time, Socrates was saying, look, we're advancing in many ways. We're learning these scientific things, and that's well and good. And we're focused on learning more about the earth, and that's fine too. But what we really need to do is focus on the thinking that we are doing, because it is the thinking that we are doing that is causing the problems that we are experiencing in our lives. So Socrates was trying to develop methodologies for breaking down faulty thinking and then replacing it with thinking that made sense or that makes sense. Moving forward, we see that critical thinking now today is widely used. The term is widely used in human societies across the world. Yet we still lack a robust conception of it in common use. Now, we do have a robust conception of it. Excuse me, we do have a robust conception of critical thinking, which has been developing over the last 4 or 5 decades. But humans have yet to embrace this robust conception. And people are still saying things like, well, we don't really have a definition of critical thinking. And they're fishing around for something that sounds good, or they're getting a sound bite, because people love sound bites. They want everything in simplified terms very frequently. But critical thinking is not going to be found in a sound bite. It's not going to be found in a simple book which offers 1 or 2 suggestions for improving your life. Critical thinking is a way of living in which we embrace intellectual virtues. This means we are continually working toward embodying, for example, intellectual humility. So that instead of being intellectually arrogant, where we believe that we already know everything there is to know, we begin at a very different place. We begin with the idea that there are many things that we do not know, that there are many, many more things that we do not know than we will ever know. And so we're aware of the limitations of our knowledge, and we're willing to admit to the limitations of our knowledge, and there is no problem in admitting this. And so we want to understand, again, the importance of this intellectual virtue in our life, as well as others, such as intellectual perseverance, the propensity to keep moving through difficulties in issues and problems, even when it is difficult, even when it is, even when we are feeling some mental pain, even when we want to do everything that we can to protect our current ways of thinking, which is, again, the normal way of human thinking. So we want to develop intellectual humility, again, intellectual perseverance, intellectual autonomy, so that we are willing to stand alone in our beliefs after we have done our best thinking in a situation, not standing alone in our beliefs in order to just say, well, I have my way of thinking and you have your way of thinking, and everybody's way of thinking is just as good as everyone else's way of thinking. This is an absurd position. No, when we are thinking and embracing intellectual autonomy, we also embrace the tools of criticality. And so we think at the highest level that we can, and we then are willing to stand alone in our beliefs. Another important intellectual virtue that we want to aspire to and embody is intellectual integrity, so that we expect the same or more of ourselves than we do of other people. We say what we mean and we mean what we say. We live according to the principles that we espouse. Other intellectual virtues that we want to aspire to include intellectual courage, the courage to look at my own beliefs honestly and in a forthright way, and examine them truthfully to see what is really there. So intellectual courage is very important. Fair-mindedness is an organizing intellectual virtue. One thing that is missing in human life is the ability to intellectually empathize with other people, especially those that we disagree with. And intellectual empathy is very directly connected with fair-mindedness. So these are some of the intellectual virtues that we aspire to as developing critical thinkers. So going back to the history of critical thinking. So again, beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, we began to see a movement toward critical thinking to some extent in education, especially in the United States and in some other countries. And unfortunately, what has happened since then is that the term critical thinking, again, has gained in use, but has gained very little in actual currency, because most people do not have a rich conception of critical thinking that enables them to think about their thinking, to find problems in their thinking, to correct those problems in thinking, to improve their thinking in order to think at a higher level of quality. So in critical thinking, we're trying to develop let us say, an executive function of the mind, which thinks about its own thinking. Normally in human life, we think and we act. We think and we act upon the thinking that we're doing. And sometimes the thinking that we're doing is perfectly fine. And sometimes that thinking is flawed. Critical thinking enables us to examine our thinking before we act upon the thinking. Humans are facing a very challenging time in our history. And this is because there are certain threats that we face. And if we don't accept that we face these threats, then we are going to be doomed. And one of the major threats, as we know, that we face is the problem of global warming or climate change. We know that humans are contributing significantly to this problem. We know that humans are going to have to be the ones to find solutions to the problem. And those solutions are directly dependent upon our ability to think critically about the problems. And this means that we have to be able to think collectively. We have to think not only collectively, but we have to work together, bringing our best thinking together to solve these problems. And there are other problems that we face. We know that the world is becoming more and more challenging. We are increasingly interconnected. Things are happening at a faster and faster pace. It is very difficult for us to keep up with these changes. In order to have any kind of business or to work within any field of study, we're going to have to continually learn and to develop new understandings within these fields. All of this requires critical thinking. In our approach to critical thinking, there are some basic conceptual sets that we focus on. I'm going to briefly mention them now. And all of these conceptual sets were developed by originally Dr. Richard Paul, beginning again really in the 1960s with his early dissertation. Moving forward to today, we have continued to develop the theory. Our focus is to develop tools of mind that enable us to reason at the highest level of quality in order to solve the problems that we face and in order to live at the highest level of quality individually and collectively. So within our framework for thinking, for critical thinking, you will find the elements of reasoning. What this means is that we're focused on how to take thinking apart. We ask, what is involved in reasoning? How does reasoning go wrong? What causes problems in reasoning? How do we enter and improve our thinking to eliminate these problems? So we need to understand reasoning. We need to understand what is entailed in the reasoning that we're doing every day. And in pursuing the question, what is involved in reasoning, Dr. Richard Paul early on said, well, let's see how to boil this down. And he came up with, over decades of working on this question, he came up with basically 8 elements of reasoning. Whenever we reason, whenever you reason, whenever anyone reasons, no matter how well or poorly they're reasoning, they have a purpose. They're asking questions. They're using information. They're making inferences. These inferences are based on their assumptions, which are connected to their concepts, which comes from and informs their point of view, all of which leads to implications and consequences. So again, the elements of reasoning that we are using continually throughout the day or routinely throughout the day are purpose, question, information, inferences, concepts, assumptions, point of view, and implications. Our argument is that when people are aware that they're using these elements of reasoning, they have a much better chance of entering these elements and finding problems in these elements, and then again, improving their reasoning thereby. Once we've taken our thinking apart, we know what their parts are in a given a situation. So I can say, well, all right, my purpose in parenting is this, and the key questions I'm asking are these, and the information I'm using is as follows. And once we've done that, then we can ask, well, how do we assess that reasoning now that we know what the reasoning is? Well, we assess it through universal intellectual standards, such as clarity, accuracy, precision, relevance, depth, breadth, logicalness, fairness, sufficiency. And this is a beginning place. Intellectual standards, these few that I've mentioned, are essential intellectual standards that we use in everyday life, but that we need to be using more explicitly in order to improve our thinking. These intellectual standards come from a much broader set of intellectual standards in all common or everyday languages, but they give us a beginning place. Then, as I've already mentioned, in critical thinking, we're not just concerned about your ability to gather relevant information, for example, your ability to engage in any individual skill set. We're focused on how you are living your life. So are you embracing intellectual virtues, again, such as intellectual perseverance, intellectual autonomy, intellectual empathy, and so forth? So we have intellectual virtues that we're reaching toward. We need intellectual standards, such as clarity, accuracy, and relevance, to judge our reasoning in an individual situation. And we need to know how to take our thinking apart and focus on the parts of reasoning. We also need to be aware that we can study these parts of thinking and these intellectual standards, and we can think that we are embodying intellectual virtues while we are actually deceiving ourselves. So humans have the great problem of self-deception. And self-deception enables us to act in egocentric ways and in sociocentric ways. And when we engage in either of these barriers to critical thinking, then there are going to be problems in our ability to think at the highest level that we can. So egocentric thinking basically means either that we're being selfish in a situation, or a person is locked into a narrow or closed-minded way of looking at a situation. Those are broad ways of looking at egocentric thinking. And then we have all of the defense mechanisms that we are already aware of: projection, stereotyping, and so forth. Then we have the problem of sociocentric thinking, which means that we are either looking for more for our group without regard to the rights and needs of others, or we as a group are locked into our narrow way of thinking and we're unable to see other ways of thinking that are legitimate and that are reasonable. And one of the tendencies that comes from sociocentric thinking is the perceived need to be validated by other people. So if you are always looking to be validated by someone else, then there are going to be problems in your thinking. You cannot think using your own reasoning and with the tools of criticality, then you can easily be persuaded to do things that are not in your interest, or they're not in the common interest, they're not concerned with the common good. So we have these conceptual sets within our approach that are learned and are internalized over a lifetime once you begin to study the concepts and apply them in everyday life. At the Foundation for Critical Thinking, we are concerned to advance fair-minded critical thinking across human societies. We have always worked predominantly in education, but we also work with business managers and leaders, government leaders, military leaders, and indeed anyone who is interested in developing his or her thinking using the tools of criticality. We have a number of outreach projects that you can participate in. One important one is the Center for Critical Thinking Community online, which is you can reach at criticalthinkingcommunity.org. There you will find the world's largest digital library, many print materials, as well as audio and visual materials, videos that you can watch, audios you can listen to. We also have an academy full of many activities that you can complete in order to help you develop your understanding of these foundations I've been introducing. We offer a place for you to establish your own study groups. You can participate in our study groups that we offer in the community. We offer webinars. We offer webinar Q&A sessions, so you can come and ask us questions, our fellows and scholars. So we hope that you'll join us at our community online. We also offer professional development on site at your site. We can also offer professional development through online customized workshops and courses. We offer semester-long online courses for credit through Sonoma State University, and we offer conferences and workshops at different times throughout the year. We hope that you will join us as we continue to work to advance and to cultivate fair-minded critical societies. Our organization is now over 4 decades in length. We are the longest running organization on critical thinking in the world. We're the longest running nonprofit organization on critical thinking in the world. And we need everyone to help us continue our work. So we will hope you will join us in our work.